election is important. We know in our bones this one is more consequential.
And this is the most important election in the history of our country.
From Bloomberg QuickTake, I'm Everett White. Welcome to the episode 6 of the most important election ever. After a summer of protests over racial injustice and police brutality, the US has had a reckoning of sorts with just one of the many cultural issues dividing it, from LGBTQ plus and women's rights to the fate of immigration policy to the widening rift between the haves and have-nots. Here to discuss all of those cultural and identity flashpoints, how Trump and Biden relate to them, and how all of this figures into the 2020 election is Rebecca Greenfield, a Bloomberg News reporter and editor covering diversity and work culture and host of Bloomberg's The Paycheck podcast. Rebecca, thanks for joining us on the most important election ever. How goes it?
Thanks for having me. I'm like everyone else, okay, making it, just counting down the days to election and just making it through the pandemic.
Well, 6 days left, or 7 days left if you're counting the today. First things first, Rebecca, have you voted yet? And if not, when are you planning to vote?
Yes, yesterday, the person giving me the flu shot asked me this if I had voted yet. So I felt very ashamed that I haven't voted yet. There's early voting here in New York where I live, and I was deterred by the long line. So I may actually just end up going in person and voting on voting day, but I do plan on making it to the polls.
Well, I'm sure you're not the only American or New Yorker who's planning to do the exact same thing. But let's jump right in. Rebecca, let's set the stage for our viewers. 2020 has been a year of continued strife over cultural issues, particularly race, ethnicity, and gender. Could you describe some of these flashpoints leading into the 2020 election?
Yeah, so 2020 has been a unique year for sure. And the last 4 years, which have felt very different than the previous 8 years. And I think leading into the election, the biggest flashpoint that I can think of has definitely been the Black Lives Matter protests of the late spring and summer have definitely been a pivotal point for our country, a huge civil rights moment, but also have figured pretty prominently in the debates in the election. It's something that has come up in the debates and something that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are running on in very different ways. Donald Trump has definitely positioned protesters and city unrest as something that he, needs to save us from, and talks about the anarchists on, and there being both sides to the violence. Whereas Joe Biden, who also definitely also says that the violence is not a good thing, he is more sympathetic to the protesters, certainly. So I think that has been kind of like the big lead up. I think city violence, urban unrest. Anyway, it's been a huge talking point for both candidates. I think the question that a lot of people are asking is how motivating is that for voters, since there are so many other issues on the ballot.
Wow. So you touched on a lot of different points there, specifically in terms of how it's going to affect voters and the ways that Trump and Biden are sort of handling these tensions. And I mean, it's no secret that a lot of these flashpoints have had Trump, his administration, his policies in the middle of them at some point. How has the Trump administration handled some of these tensions, from the Black Lives Matter protests to just police brutality in general?
Yeah, so I think people think that Donald Trump has inflamed the racial tensions. I think he, in the first protest against Joe Biden, one of the standout moments was when Chris Wallace, the moderator, asked if Donald Trump would, say that white supremacy is bad. And Donald Trump, kind of when pushed to further say it's bad, had this moment where he's talking about the Proud Boys, and which is a white supremacist group, and how the Proud Boys have to kind of stand down and stand by. So people see comments like that, which is something the president has made throughout his presidency, as, not bringing the country together, not denouncing white supremacy, it is more like fanning the flames of these tensions, which we are seeing boil over in cities across the country, and sometimes in violent ways and deadly ways. So I think that certainly that's been Donald Trump's kind of orientation to this movement.
So you mentioned Trump fanning some of these flames. What other situations has Trump, in your opinion, fanned the flames of in terms of cultural issues?
Yeah, the one that I was thinking about this really comes to mind, which, I think the emboldening of white supremacists in the last 4 years has really been a huge issue. And when I think of that, I think of the Charlottesville protests. So, and Donald Trump saying that there were very fine people on both sides. I think that was a defining moment of his presidency, and another moment where it was seen as signaling to these white supremacist groups who do support Donald Trump. And again, was a violent protest, and images of those protests and white supremacists marching in the streets of Charlottesville, I think, really resonated with people and changed the way we see our country.
So that's a good point. You mentioned the protests in Charlottesville sort of showing the ugly face of some of these issues. What else can you say about the upswell and awareness of some of these cultural issues? How has it been a net positive? Has there been anything to write home about in terms of awareness in 2020?
Yeah, so I think what's been really interesting is that we've seen huge cultural movements and protests during the Trump administration. The Black Lives Matter protests that happened this summer, which I've already mentioned, have estimated to be one of the biggest protest movements in the history of the world. There were worldwide protests. That is huge, and it's hard to say, what would have happened had Trump not been president. We can't prove that didn't happen, but that did happen, in the last 4 years. Another similar example of a big protest movement that happened, which I do think as a result of Donald Trump becoming president, was the Me Too movement and the women's movement. The first Women's March happened right around Donald Trump's inauguration. It was at the time, and may still be, the biggest single day protest in the history of the country. There have been multiple women's marches since then. And that was a response to the Access Hollywood tape that had come out during the 2016 election, where Donald Trump made his infamous remarks about grabbing women without their permission, and also the multiple allegations of harassment about Trump that had come out during his election. So that protest movement specifically came as a reaction to Trump being elected. And then also the Me Too movement, all of the reporting that many journalists did on Harvey Weinstein and then others, again, was a reaction to having an alleged sexual harasser in this really important position of power. So I think I don't know if those things would have happened without Donald Trump being president. I don't know. I don't want to say there's a net positive or negative, but we have seen huge cultural movements as a reaction to this president, and those have changed our society and the world.
So you mentioned BLM, Me Too, these movements being backlashes to the president. What about the backlash to Black Lives Matter and Me Too? You touched on it shortly, the emboldening of white supremacist groups and hate groups. Could you speak a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so there has been an emboldening of white supremacist groups and hate crimes. There have been lots of organizations who track hate crimes. One thing when I was researching this, I found was that hate groups in 2018 surged 7%, specifically white supremacist and white nationalist groups. Hate crimes have been up since Donald Trump has been president. It's causal, but that's definitely happening. There's also, we've seen at the protests, counter-protesters do show up. Sometimes they're armed. Some of those have turned into violent and sometimes deadly clashes. So anytime there's big cultural change or cultural movements, there are always people who don't want that change. And so we are definitely seeing that with Black Lives Matter movement. With the Me Too movement, there's been lots of talk of backlash. I also, when I was thinking about this, remembered, a year after the Me Too movement exploded with the Harvey Weinstein reporting, we had the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, which was also wrapped up in the Me Too movement, and about, there were many discussions of allegations of his own behavior, and he did get a seat on the court. So there's definitely like a balance and a counterbalance thing that does happen the pendulum swings, but it's swinging very quickly in our current modern world.
Absolutely. And we saw a little bit of B-roll back there of Amy Coney Barrett's nomination with Donald Trump. And now today, the news came out that she's been confirmed yesterday, solidifying a conservative majority on the Supreme Court for decades to come. What sorts of concerns would minorities and marginalized groups have about that? And what does this mean on the other side for conservatives, for those on the right?
Yeah, so the courts, the Supreme Court has been at the center of many big cases that do protect or erode rights for certain groups. I think, interestingly, this year we saw a big Supreme Court case that was a huge win for LGBTQ workers, who the Supreme Court recognized them as protected under the Civil Rights Act, which is the law that protects against discrimination against women and people of color. So gay people are now included in that. And of course, another big decision was marriage equality that happened under the Obama administration. So those are the kinds of things that we can see come out of the court. I think going forward with a more conservative court, there's a lot of talk about abortion, which is a big women's rights issue. We've written about this a bit, about how the court might go about restricting abortion under a new court. That's definitely, a concern against advocates for abortion. There's Roe v. Wade, which is the law that says that, it's a federal protection for abortion, but there are also lots of other ways that states try to restrict abortion. So that's definitely something that no matter who becomes the president, the court, is separate of that. So Donald Trump will have already made his mark on that world. That
makes sense. There are a lot of other issues that the SCOTUS will be privy to, particularly immigration. Donald Trump has made no secret of his want to limit immigration in terms of the Muslim ban or the current policy of family separation. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that's a cultural wedge issue, how that's going to affect the 2020 election?
Yeah, I think immigration, which is actually, I think that one of the reasons that many white supremacist groups do support Donald Trump is the administration's stance on immigration and who is a citizen and who isn't, and bringing who gets to come into the country and who doesn't. Since, again, one of the very first things that Donald Trump did was the Muslim ban, and it was immediately sued, and it's been in a lot of legal battles, but I think is at the heart of just like a change in our stance on immigration and immigration policies under Donald Trump. There has been a much more aggressive or a stronger use of ICE under Donald Trump, and I think Joe Biden would have a different stance. He has said had said he would go back to more of what we saw under President Obama. So, stopping a moratorium on deportations for 100 days, and then going back to the previous policy, and then also, only deporting people who are convicted felonies. So it's definitely not as an aggressive stance on immigration as Donald Trump has done, which I do agree has been a signature policy of this administration.
And speaking of signature policies of the administration, a lot of these actions that affect marginalized groups have been via executive order, not necessarily through Congress or through the Supreme Court. Could you talk a little bit about that and how it sort of could come undone under Biden if he were to do the same thing? Well, you touched on it for a short time, though.
Yeah, so I think which we saw with Donald Trump early on in his presidency was the use of executive order, and also undoing executive orders that Obama had also used a lot of under his presidency as a way to get around a Congress that might not pass legislation that you want. We've seen a lot of executive orders in the last few weeks having to do specifically for diversity initiatives that the Trump administration doesn't like. And so that is a way to get something done and get it done your way. But it does mean if a new administration comes in, it is easier to undo.
And what's to stop a next administration from doing the same thing? It seems like this is becoming just a political ping pong at a certain point, these cultural issues. How is there any sort of consistent change going to be enacted either under Trump or Biden?
It's a really good question. I can't predict the future. I think, to pass laws, you need Congress. That's the reality of it. I think, we'll just have to see how, if Biden or Trump can actually pass laws in these areas that we're talking about.
And that kind of trails into our next question, and it shows how, just the importance. But our biggest question, Rebecca, and you know the question, the reason we're all here, why is the 2020 race the most important election ever?
Yeah, for the causes that we're talking about, I think for minority groups, for women, for people of color, for immigrants, for people who, for people of specific religions, the last 4 years have really seen a very different approach than the previous 8 years or even before that. And the question is, what will the next 4 years look like? Will it be a continuation of, emboldening of white supremacists, or attempting to roll back certain protections, or, less protection for abortion, you name it. So, what will former years of that look like, and will really solidify some of these things that we're seeing happen? Or, will it be going back to what we saw during the Obama administration, which I think these groups would have said there was more progress, more openness, more inclusivity. So I think it's a really important moment. Because 4 years is a long time, and a new administration, as we've seen with Donald Trump, can really change things.
Well, that's a great place to close it out. You heard it here first, people. With less than a week left before the 2020 election, please go out and vote. Make your voices heard, and tune in next week for our final episode of the most important election ever. Rebecca Greenfield, I just wanted to thank you again for joining us. And Rebecca, if you had anything you wanted to plug from your team, please go right ahead. I'd love to.
Follow Bloomberg News. We do a lot of great coverage. We cover, we have a whole specific team covering inequality and diversity, which I think is unique. So we have a lot of great stories. You can follow me on Twitter at @RZGreenfield, and I tweet all my favorite stories from all of our great reporters.
Awesome, Rebecca. Thanks for joining us on the most important election ever. I'm Everett White. This is Bloomberg QuickTake. Bye-bye.